Today is one of our Road Rules 360 episodes, and I am here with John Burrill, former TMR Road Rules subject matter expert. We are on Gubby Gubby country. Hello, John.
Hello, Wendy. Good to be here.
Good to be here. Now, today we are wearing our very brand new T-shirts, fully merchandised. So just in case we wondered what we were doing.
You can't see it. It's such a shame.
They're very dazzling. Our
You need to start doing YouTube videos as well, I think.
No. I had to do a video one last week. That's enough. One's enough. But our artwork was done by Chris Woodard, one of our super amazing volunteers. John, you are also a volunteer, and I'm a volunteer. And we are just going to be discussing the road rules, and like every other episode that we discuss the road rules, we are here to entertain and inform, hopefully not put you to sleep. This isn't advice, an opinion, or recommendation, or anything like that. It's just our take on the road rules. All right, then.
Right.
So now we are continuing with our bike rules legislation. We're on the website www.qld.gov.au/transport/safety/fines/cycling, and we are doing speeding. Speeding. And I am really interested in today's topic. As John and I do each time, I read out the description of the offence on the left-hand side, the legislation section, and the fine on it. This is more of the car rules that are just given over to bikes.
That's right.
This is on this section.
Yes.
This is not specific to bicycle riders, but it is legislation that is for cars that bikes need to heed. Would you say that's
correct,
a fair
yes.
way of
There's
doing
a
it?
separate fine, but it's matched. In other words, the fine that is usually given to a car driver or a motorised vehicle driver is the same for bicycles. Probably just by way of reminder as well, if you get a fine in a car, you get demerit points as well on your licence. Any and every fine for a cyclist, there are no demerit points ever attached to it.
Yeah.
For pretty obvious reasons.
Pretty hard to...
You
don't start with any to be...
You don't have a licence to ride a bike. You could be a complete and utter non-licence holder and jump on a push bike and off you go. So obviously, they can't attach demerit points.
Yeah, that's it.
For your licence
That's
on
it.
these fines.
All right, so let's crack on, John.
Yeah.
Okay, so the description of the offence... They're all Section 20 in the Queensland Road Rules. Mm-hmm. So I'll just go with description of offence, exceeding the speed limit by less than 11 kilometres an hour. So that's basically between the speed limit of the road and, say, if it's a 50 zone, so that would be a 61. So that little margin there. Yep. And that fine there is $309 for a bicyclette. Like, crazy. All right, John.
They've gone huge.
So we were talking just a moment before we came on air about some of the very slow roads, the shared paths and on the bridge, which is a pedestrian area, and those areas are 10 kilometres an hour.
Yes.
And the footpath is also 10 kilometres an hour?
No footpath. Unless there is a very specific sign that applies to the footpath, then the speed limit on the footpath is always the same as whatever the road is beside it.
Okay.
So if you're on a bicycle, got to be specific here that we are talking about a bicycle.
Yep.
Then the speed limit on the road is whatever the speed limit, the speed limit on the footpath or on the path is the same as what it is on the road.
Oh, see, this is so good.
It's a lot of people don't realise that.
No. That's great to know.
The places we were talking about earlier, like Kurilpa Bridge and some of the other pedestrian/cycling bridges in CBD, are signposted at 10. I know other places where you've got 10 kilometre speed limits on paths, ridiculously low, absolutely crazy. A lot of people have made the excuse, and I've even heard the police say this, that it's only advisory, but it isn't advisory because the sign that they use is a regulatory sign. If it was an advisory speed limit, it would be a completely different colour. It would be a different sign altogether. These are regulatory speed limits, and when we expand on these, it's interesting that what you just read out there was really just one small part. If you look at each of these, all it is a different fine for a different measure of exceeding the speed limit.
Let's go through it all of it, and then we can talk about the whole general
Absolutely,
thing. How about that? All right, so the first fine is 11 kilometres an hour above the speed limit, and that is $309.
Yep.
Pretty hefty for a bike anyway.
Yep.
Presumably these are the same fines for cars and bikes.
Yes.
Yes. Exceeding the limit between 11 kilometres an hour, but not more than 20, that's $464. And then we step it up. So between 20, but not more than 30, that's $696. Exceeding the speed limit but between 30 and 40, that's $1,161. And then over 40 kilometres an hour, it's $1,780. Woohoo! This is steep. I mean, for a bicycle, it strikes me as nuts.
It's nuts. I mean, let's just go bonkers and just think about this for a minute. So, Kurilpa Bridge, 10 kilometre an hour speed limit. There is a slight downward slope in one direction. Let's just say you go whacking along Kurilpa Bridge at 52 kilometres an hour, which is doable on a push bike.
And
especially if it's a racing bike and you're, pretty fit, you can do 50.
And that could be, for instance, at, 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night when there's no pedestrians.
No
so
pedestrians,
that's not...
no nothing, just a policeman hiding in the shadows. $1,780
Nuts.
You owe. It's insane.
It
insane. Really is. And, this is something I think that lobby groups and the bicycle user groups and Bicycle Queensland, this should be top of their agenda to actually see some common sense injected into these fines.
That's very interesting because Bike Queensland has got a new CEO. Bike Queensland, I've always been a bit, found them a bit recreational bicyclists. So hopefully now less on recreational and more on transportation. So this is a really important thing. Here in Caboolture, obviously we have a lot of people with high levels in income, medium levels of income, but also a lot on low income. So if you're going along maybe the Wamuran Rail Trail, what would be the speed of the Wamuran Rail Trail, do you reckon?
It doesn't actually run next to a road.
No.
So you can't take that. The way it's worked out is there is 2 distinct speed limits across the whole of Queensland and on roads or paths that are not signed. They're called the default speed limits. Inside a built-up area, the default speed limit is 50. Outside of a built-up area, the speed limit is 100.
What would that be there? It would be a built-up area?
It's a built-up area at the beginning where you're actually within the confines of Caboolture itself. But once you get out of Caboolture and heading towards Wamuran, you're in open country. Right. So the speed limit, even though there isn't a sign, or at least the times I've been on that path, and I've done it a few times, I don't ever recall seeing a speed limit sign. If it was signed as a particular speed limit, that would change it. But if there's no sign, then it's always the default speed limit that applies. So once you get out of the built-up area, and there is a definition of built-up area, but we won't go there because gets a bit complex. You can pretty much judge, the moment the path gets into a space where there's no buildings on either side, or it's pretty much an open track, it would become 100 kilometres an hour, which is obviously a bit silly for a cyclist because you wouldn't be going that speed, but even 50.
But it's interesting. I mean, we're going to get to scooter legislation, and they do kind of tear down there at 100 kilometres an hour, I'm sure. So
how do they now? Well,
so I think this is really interesting. I have an e-bike, as you know, and there's a speed max that's on it at 25 kilometres an hour. Yes. Now, if I don't have the motor on, like without
you can pedal faster than that.
Yeah. So can I go above 25 kilometres an hour?
Absolutely.
So it's when it's got the motor on, oddly enough, I'm restricted in the speed, but if I turn the motor off, then I can increase my speed.
Well, that's it. You become a normal push bike.
That's completely stupid. That is the dumbest. I mean, we've been talking about some pretty dumb legislation, but that one's right up there. That one has got to be completely stupid. And so on an e-bike, you can go 25 max, but even though the street is at 50 or 60.
Yes.
But if you're on a bicycle, then you can go 50 and 60. Like, that's just crazy. What is that? Who designed that? Who designed that legislation? So basically, if I've understood this, if you're on a road-related area or the footpath, and the speed limit of the road, the car bit, basically, is 50 kilometres an hour in a built-up area.
Yes.
The speed limit on the footpath is 50 kilometres an hour.
Yes.
Now, if you're going on, say, that bridge that you were talking about, and say it didn't have a sign,
Yes.
then you could go up to
50 kilometres an
50
hour.
kilometres an hour in a built-up area.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that would make more sense.
Absolutely. I'm sure there are plenty of bridges and paths and footpaths and places that are away from a road where that would apply.
Okay, I've got my fairy wings on and my little wand, and I say, all right, let's get the legislation for bicycle riders cleaned up and say e-bike riders should be able to go at the same speed as non-e-bike riders.
Well, they can, so long as they're pedalling.
I just don't get that. But say I go, all right, well, that's a stupid law, because I think it's a stupid law, and I have all the power that be to change the legislation. How complicated would it be to get that legislation changed? Is that beyond your scope of knowledge, or?
Well, there's always a way to provide legislation. If all you need is, because legislation is based on offences. There's a lot of people say, well, why don't we legislate to allow somebody to do this, X, Y, Z? You can't really do that. What you have to do is say the law says that this is an offence. But then what you do is you provide exemptions or exceptions for that situation. What we have to be careful of here is muddling up the different types of modes of transport. Because if you're talking about an e-scooter, the only way you can propel or can go on it is using the electric motor.
Yeah.
That has a very specific speed limit attached to it. In the case of an electric bicycle, it's very different, because if the motor's being used, then the motor is basically designed to cut out at a particular speed limit, which I think is what happened with yours.
I noticed
this. If you go down a hill and once you hit 25 kilometres an hour and start to go above it, the motor will cut out. So you're then under pedal power or gravity power, whatever you like to call it. So it's not actually a speed limit sign. It's not even, well, it is legislated for, but it's not in this rule that we're talking about here. It's just a case of the vehicle is engineered in such a way that means your motor cuts out. How can I put this? There's a lot of illegal electric bicycles out there.
Yeah,
go a lot faster than 25 kilometres an hour.
And just a heads up on those. So often people talk about how they burst up in flames, and scooters as well, the little two-wheeler scooters. Yeah. And it's because the batteries are mismatched with the original product. Yeah. That's my understanding, is that people buy one down, I don't know, the pub, online, whatever, and then they go, oh, you just get a battery, or we've got a battery, we've got that online. But it's not the same brand battery that matches the scooter, and it's that mismatch which is the problem.
It's usually the homemade things and the kits and the things that you get from some strange source from overseas on the internet and what have you. They're the ones that would fail. When we're looking at speeding, it's critical to understand the differences between these vehicles and the different rules that apply to the different vehicles. Just to sort of clarify, let's just say you're either on the road on a push bike, or if you're on a path beside the road on a push bike, and the speed limit on that road is 40 or 60, 80, and it's signposted at that speed, that is the speed limit for the bicycle as well as the car.
So you've got a school zone, it's 40 kilometres an hour.
Yep.
And you've got a kid just come out of school, a lot of pent-up energy, desperate to kind of get home.
I'm preempting your question.
Yeah. So it's on a hill, and he's going down there. Yeah. And so say he gets up to 60 kilometres an hour. Yeah. Technically,
it's breaking the law.
He could be up for $700.
Yeah. Okay. It is, again, you need a policeman to come on here to talk about this, because I remember having involved conversations when I worked in TMR with the police about this. They have to be extremely careful about giving tickets to minors. What they do, particularly if it's a school child, it's usually to do with helmet wearing. Helmet wearing is the main potential fine that kids get pulled up for. And usually the police, it's just a conversation they have with the child. The child goes away, no ticket issued. If it happens regularly, the police arrange to have, just a diplomatic discussion with the parents of the child, just to say, look, this is what's happening. The big hope is that resolves the problem, because there are very few tickets issued to children in those situations. But if we're talking about people of adult age, then it's a different ball game. If you go too fast on your push bike, you can expect a fine of this magnitude, which is scary, I can tell you, coming down a hill.
Yeah, so you told me, but you've always had a motorbike or one for a long time, and many moons ago.
Yes. Coming down Mount Cootha was a pretty classic thing. You could be riding a motorcycle at the speed limit, which was 50 kilometres an hour, and all of a sudden, whoosh, push bike would come flying past you over the solid line and just disappear onto the horizon, whatever you like to call it, on the steep hill down. That was a long time ago when that happened to me. It happened a few times, actually. Back in the day, we're talking about 25, 30 years ago, the police equipment wasn't capable of picking up cyclists. The equipment they used back then just wasn't capable of being accurate when basically aimed at a cyclist. Whereas nowadays, equipment has become a lot more modern in the sense that they now can accurately pick up. And a lot of cyclists have been caught with speeding tickets coming down Mount Cootha and other popular places where cyclists ride.
So I mean, I don't do recreational riding. I'm a strictly little urban pottering around here. How hard is it to restrict the speed on a bicycle when you're going down a hill?
Well, you've got brakes, and obviously you would need to be on the brakes, or at least feathering the brakes. I mean, your brakes wouldn't be full on. Your brakes would probably get quite hot. I'm used to motorcyclists, and I know that the disc brake on a motorcycle is probably a lot stronger than the kind of disc brake that you would get nowadays on a bike. Obviously, you've got no engine braking, which is what you often rely on a motor vehicle to hold the speed back.
Yep.
And you just feather the brake in the case of a car, or feather both brakes in the case of a motorcycle. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the assumption is that you're in control of the vehicle, and to be in control of the vehicle, then you are required to make sure that you're going at whatever the speed limit is or less.
So if you're going down that hill that you were just describing at, I don't know, say 60, 70, 80, 100 kilometres an hour on a bicycle, I guess, you know, you're kind of a young bloke and you're into speed, and hey, there would be more than one person who's like that, and you're going down the hill. Say you misjudge it, you falter and you come off your bike.
Yep.
How severe would the damage be on your body if you did come off at 100 kilometres an hour in that space?
Well, I mean, I think the answer to that is to look at the trauma statistics for motorcyclists, because motorcyclists, or at least the conscientious ones, generally wear clothes that are designed to help to protect your body in the event of a crash at that kind of speed. You know, padded, special materials that don't wear so quickly as standard clothing, proper boots, gloves, helmet, obviously, which is required.
And full-face helmet.
Full-face helmet. And on a bicycle, I would say very seldom would you be wearing any kind of protective gear. So the outcome from a trauma perspective in relation to injuries on your body would be much more severe, I'd say. So, gee. But then there's the other question, how much damage are you going to do to everybody else? The answer is probably not much if you crash a bicycle, whereas if you crash a car or even a motorcycle, really, the potential for running into somebody else as you're crashing and damaging or injuring other people, it becomes higher the bigger and the heavier your vehicle is.
And that's an interesting point. So when it comes to speeding in a car, the main problem with that is actually people outside the car. Whereas when you're on a bicycle, the main problem is more at the Darwin Award ends, where it's about how stupid are you before you end up killing yourself.
That's it.
That's a really good differentiating point. And where does the duty of care lie in terms of legislation for speeding and things like that? I mean, it's an interesting, that changes the conversation. But I do think that legislation for bicycles does need to be different than legislation for cars.
There was a time when it was. There was a time, not all that long ago, probably 20 years ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, there were, all the bicycle rules had their own specific fines, and it was a lot more rational than it is now, where it's just straightforward. Whatever the fine is for a car, it's exactly the same for a bicycle. Back then, there was the cycle fines were a lot lower.
But even like the legislation, so we last week we talked about, when you're inside a car and using your arm to signal left.
Yes.
In a car, it makes sense. You wouldn't do that. On a bicycle, it makes absolute sense to do that.
It does, yeah.
So that even using car legislation for bicycles, I'm not quite sure why you can't create specific legislation for bicycles. I mean, it could be a modification.
There are some rules that are very specifically for bicycles, and I think we went through them.
That was our first episode. But there were not very many, not very many at all, and everything else. It's as if cars, bicycles are the same, and that's
right.
just nuts. I watched a video, and maybe we talked about it last week. It was the difference between talking about it from road safety and road danger. And cars, by the fact that they have these high speeds above 50 kilometres an hour, 40, 50 kilometres an hour, that's already a dangerous speed for anybody who's not in a car. Cars are just dangerous. Using car legislation, it just doesn't make sense at all.
It doesn't. You're right. There's a lot of mismatch, but it's the most convenient way to do it.
But convenient for who?
Well, probably the police, probably state government, to be able to just sort of put blanket. It's easy. Whenever it all goes up, everything goes up.
I've got an idea, John. We do all the road rules for bicycles, and then we retrofit them to cars.
Wow.
So that would be great.
It.
So we get speed limits at 10 kilometres an hour everywhere you go.
Well, hang on. That would apply to motorcycles too. No, I'm against that.
All right, but we get everywhere is 30 kilometres an hour. You can do 30 kilometres an hour on a motorcycle.
Of course you can,
You can do 10 kilometres an hour on a motorcycle
you
more
can.
easily than you could on a bicycle.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So you start with bicycles and then you retrofit all the other, or you do all the road speeds to 30 kilometres an hour.
You're radical thinking there.
I'm always, every week we have these conversations. I go, but we're looking at this in a weird way. Anything else to add before we close up on speeding?
There's a thing called a speed limited area. It applies to cycles as well as other vehicles, but it's something, again, not a lot of people know about. What you get sometimes, and it's usually used in a residential area. So you've got an enclosed residential area with maybe 2 or 3 roads coming into the area, and in each of those roads you'll have a speed limit sign with the word area underneath it. Now what that means is that speed limit applies to that network of roads. In other words, you can go into that estate or whatever it might be, turn into another street, and the speed limit would be the same. Say it's usually 40 kilometres an hour speed limit area. So you go into that area, you turn onto another street, it's still 40. You turn into another street, it's still 40, until you get to a sign where it says end area.
And what about caravan parks? Because they have 10 kilometres an hour.
Or they have what thing usually marked as shared zones, which is, again, not a lot of people understand the shared zone rules, but from a speed limit perspective, there will usually be a speed limit associated with the shared zone. 10 kilometres an hour is normal. I've seen them on beaches at 30 kilometres an hour, even 50. And basically what it means is all the vehicular traffic has to give way to pedestrians. Pedestrians become number one priority in a shared zone. That's why the speed limits are all set low. Often seen in gated communities like residential care type communities where there's a gate and only certain people are allowed in there if you've got a pass or whatever. They're usually signed as shared zones and you've got to ride slow.
Okay, so I'm just thinking shared path. For instance, obviously we've just talked about the Wembley Rail Trail. That goes according to the road legislation, whatever that is. Footpaths, that's the same as whatever the road speed is.
It is, if it's beside a road.
Yep. Anything about other shared areas or paths or anything else?
There are some speed limits for certain vehicles. I mean, we've talked about the motorised scooters.
Yep.
They have a governed speed limit of 25 kilometres an hour, or in fact 12 kilometres an hour if you're riding them under the age of 16.
So motorised scooters, you're talking about two-wheeler ones, not the wheelchairs.
No,
okay.
No, that's right.
Yeah, so we've just come to the end of speeding. We have been talking for a little time, and we're close to the end. Yeah. So I think we'll just wrap it up there.
We'll just wrap it up here.
Anything else that you think would be useful to add here?
I can't think of anything else.
I would like to figure out how to get the legislation for bicycles, proper legislation for bicycles. Yeah. This kind of crazy stuff, the fines are the same as cars. when the risk is completely different, when the spaces are completely different,
Yep.
when you can't use the road often on a bicycle because it's too dangerous. You can't really use the footpath very easily. Well, it's too bumpy, and then you've got pedestrians. It's a very difficult space to use.
It is.
In many ways, it's easier for scooter riders, the ones that go along at some ridiculous speed, which I'm not condoning by any stretch. But gee, I get why they would do that. I'm not saying you should take up risky behaviour, because some of them, I mean, that guy was going 194 kilometres, and you just go, we've all seen young fellas, and they may or may not be wearing a helmet, and they're just going along, and you go,
and riding like a motorcycle. You know, that's what they're doing.
I mean, it's a Darwin Award,
it is.
definitely. So the Darwin Awards, for people who don't know, the Darwin Awards are awards given to people who, how would you describe it? Self-destruct by their stupidity.
The dumbest possible thing you could ever imagine.
They're improving the gene pool of humanity by removing themselves from it. I think that's the basic line, isn't it? All right, I think we'll wrap it up there. And I'm on a meditation retreat next week, and the week after that it's Easter, so it's going to be a couple more weeks.
Yep.
And we'll see everybody back, and we'll be doing stopping and giving way.
Oh, what fun. Look forward to that one.
Fantastic. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Wendy. See ya.
See ya.
Bye.